Hello, today I'm gonna show you how to knit this dog sweater, but this is not step-by-step video. I just want to focus on the tips I usually use. Let's get started. First of all, if you're looking for a step-by-step video, please go check my description box. I put the link there. And I also put the related video down there too. Example, magic loop technique, stuff like that. Today, I am going to show you how to knit dog sweater, but not step by step. I want to focus on tips that I usually use, such as increasing techniques. I usually use make one right and left, but sometimes people don't like to use that technique because it's a little bit confusing. So stuff like that, I would like to talk about it. Few more things. Stretchy bind off. Also, little tips for magic loop technique with the thicker needle. And I talk about the length, how to adjust the length, because I knit quite short for tummy. And sometimes people want to have longer back sweater, right? But the problem is I start decreasing every other row when I start knitting only back piece and sometimes not enough stitches. So I'm going to include that too. And lastly, I want to talk about the swatch and gauge. This time, I am going to knit the sweater without making swatch. A lot of people ask me how many casts they should make to start with. Fine, I will try to help you. However, I don't know your knitting tension, so I lately ask you to knit your swatch first. But do you know what? Knitting a swatch is sometimes pain in the neck because you consume a lot of yarn and time and all that, right? So this time I'm gonna skip to make a swatch, but you can knit pretty much, perfect size. Okay, first of all, you have to look at the back of the label of your yarn. There's all kinds of the information. An important thing is right there, the bulky number 5, and it says 11, 8 millimeter, 12 stitch, and 20 rows. 4 by 4 inch. What does that mean? Which means if you need a swatch with US 11 8 millimeter needle, you should be able to have 12 stitch and 20 rows within 4 inch by 4 inch. And this is just the average. This is not your knitting tension. That's what you have to remember. If you don't want to use this average knitting tension, you can always knit your own swatch. Also, if you want to knit somebody's sweater instead of dog sweater, you definitely should knit a swatch and make sure you're knitting tension. But this is dog's sweater and the size should be okay. 1 or 2 stitches, the difference won't matter because it's a small project. Again, I really recommend you to knit your own swatch if you want to knit perfect size, especially bigger project, right? Anyway, today I am going to knit a dog sweater without needing my swatch and using that average gauge. So let's move on to the math. First of all, you need your dog's neck measurement. Mine, 11 inch, kind of loosely, which means 4 inch, which is the gauge they're indicating, versus 11 inch, my dog's neck measurement. There you go, that's my dog's measurement, right? Equal 12 stitch their gauge versus X, which is my cast on number. So the math is for X equal 11 times 12, X equal 11 times 12 divided by 4, X equal 33. And cast on should be multiple of 2. So I pick either 32 or 34 cast on to start with. All right? That's how you skip to knit the swatch. Let's move on to actual knitting. Cast on. I pick 34 cast on instead of 32 because later on I'm going to divide by front and back piece divided by 2. And when I divide it by 2, I want to have odd number. So 34 divided by 2 is 17. This is odd number. If 32, 16, that's even number. So odd number is a little bit better. And I just make cast on and I split in half, pretty much in half, right? And then I'm going to connect both ends. If you've never done the magic loop technique, please go to watch my magic loop tutorial. And I am going to start making rib, which is repeat of knit 1 and purl 1. If you want to knit little thicker rib, which is repeat of knit 2 and purl 2, then you have to cast on multiple of 4. You know what I'm saying, right? Because you want to knit repeat of knit 2 purl 2, which means set of 4 stitch, group of 4. So the cast on number should be multiple of 4. Then you can start with knit 2 and end with purl 2. And now I want to talk about biggie marker and any other markers. Because I'm using the magic loop technique, you have to split in half somewhere. And I try not to split in half where I put any markers, because every time I reach the marker, I ended up lose my marker. You know what I'm saying? Because when I reach marker, which means you have to prepare for next round, right? And I lose my markers. So I try not to split in half where I put markers. Tip number 5. I usually make purl at the end and then knit to start. When you use the magic loop, you have to split in half. And starting with knit stitch is much easier. And now I am going to show you. My first stitch is knit, so I am going to transfer 1 stitch back. So now I have a purl stitch to start. Purl stitch, which means my working yarn has to be out front, not the back, right? So put the working yarn front and then pull the needle. Then you make a purl, but you gotta be very careful. You don't make a purl like that. The other way around. Come around underneath of the cable. If I purl like that, there's gotta be yarn over, extra stitch there. You know what I'm saying? So even if you put the working yarn out front, you still have to be careful how to make a purl. The first stitch especially. Working yarn, come underneath of the cable and make sure the working yarn is out front. Right? There you go. So this is a little bit tricky part, starting with purl. If you get used to it, doesn't really, bother you too much. However, if the knitting is new to you, maybe knitting is easier to start. So now the knitting stitch to start, I'm showing you. So working yarn has to be at the back, right? And then the needle. Put that in, then there you go. You don't really have to worry about, the working yarn has to go this way or that way. This is the reason why I give you tip number 5 is when you spread in half, end with purl stitch and knit to start. And this is not only about the rib. Anything, when you're using the magic loop technique, and especially for beginner, you have to spread, right? And then you have to spread, in between 2 knit stitch, that's fine too. The stitch at the end, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter to start with knit stitch. All right, that's tip number 5. And next clip, end of the rib. So now I have to put the some markers. First of all, begin marker, I am going to change the color of the marker. This is tip number 6. If you're using same type and same color of the marker, you get confused sometimes. So change the color of marker if you need to. So after begin marker, knit 1 and then put another marker and knit 1, then add 1 more marker. The stitch in between blue markers, that's mid chest stitch, and then all knit around. After you knit 1 round, I'll show you how to increase. This time, make 1 right and left. So there you go. Increase in row number 1, knit until the marker and knit, make 1 right. Using the running thread and hook onto left needle. The left needle comes from behind. And I want you to look at the running thread. Okay, running thread, and picking up that running thread with your left needle from behind. And when you pick up that running thread shifting right side. This is make 1 right. Then if I pick up from the front, there you go, the running thread shifting left. That's the difference. So if you forget, okay, which one is make 1 right and left, remember, make 1 right, the running thread always shifting right, and left always shifting left, right? So a lot of people confuse this part, but there is meaning. And now I want you to look at the connection of the yarn. There's a connection part at the bottom, but at the back there's no connection really, right? So out front there's a V shape with a little connection at the bottom. And remember, you always knit V shape. So if it's make one left, there's no connection out front, but at the back there is a V shape with little connection at the very bottom of the V. So if it's make one left, you have to knit back loop. So now make one right, so knit front thread, just like regular knit. There you go. And then I increase one stitch there, knit one. In the mid stitch, stitch always one stitch, and now make one left, pick up the thread, and from the front, then V shape is at the back, so you will knit back loop because you have to knit V shape. You know what I'm saying? This is make one left. And row number 2 is all knit. So you have to repeat row number 1 and row number 2 until your desired length, which is top of dog's leg. Just 1 2 1 2. Okay, so I knit row number 2, and this is going to be row number 1. However, I am not using make one right and left. I'm going to use yarn over technique to increase. You can do that, but yarn over technique, if you make yarn over and then next round you just knit, you create the gap. And we usually use that hole as a design, right? But if you don't want to have that hole, you have to do a little bit, trick, twisted knit, something like that. Okay, so knit until the marker, and I was actually doing make one right, this one, right? However, I'm not using make one right. I'm using yarn over because a lot of people don't like the make one right and left. So I just did yarn over, and then when you knit next one over the marker, you have to be careful because the mid stitch has to be one stitch, but if I knit like that, mid stitch makes 2. So the right side, you have to go behind the marker, then knit mid stitch. So you really have to think the yarn over stitch should be outside of the mark. And now I did yarn over and knit. This one I don't really have to worry about. And knit until the begin marker. Using the make one right and left to increase, you can complete increasing on one row, first row. But yarn over technique, you have to complete on row number 2. There you go. Here's your yarn over. If I knit, regular knit, there's gotta be hole. There you go. If you like that design, fine. But if you don't, as you can see, this is the shifting left, right? Kinda. So I am going to knit back loop. That one. There we go. And this way there is little bit, the gap you can see, but still better. It's kind of closed. It's not like make one right or left, but it's closed stitch. So you can use yarn over technique instead of make one right and left. And next clip, I'm going to show you close yarn over technique. It's a little bit different again. So after this row, just all knit one row, then close yarn over row 1. Same as any other row number 1. Just knit until the marker, and close yarn over is just a little difference than regular yarn over. This is regular yarn over. Close yarn over is go around the right needle, okay? Go around, and working yarn has to be at the back. Regular yarn over, working yarn is out front, right? So close yarn over is the other way around, and then working yarn should be at the back. So wrap around the right needle. There we go. And then knit mid stitch. Then again, close the yarn over. Just be careful around the marker. That's it. Again, you cannot complete increasing until row number 2. Here comes. This is close yarn over you create and V shape out front. So looks a little bit like make one right. So you just knit front thread. That's about it. This is close yarn over row number 2. So except the make one right and left, everything else you complete increasing on row number 2. There we go. So whichever you want, you can use make one right and left, or just a regular yarn over or close yarn over. But close yarn over is less visible gap compared to just a regular yarn over. So I recommend number 1, make one right and left. That's best to avoid the gap. And second option is close yarn over. And you probably have a little bit of idea. When I make close yarn over, the V shape out front, just like make one right. And when I use the just a regular yarn over, the thread was shifting left. So you can use close yarn over on the right side of the marker, and you can use regular yarn over on left side of the marker. You don't really have to. This is close yarn over because it's gonna be, the right shifting, and knit the mid stitch, and this is left, so regular yarn over, whichever you want. But you know what? Mixing with both close yarn over and regular yarn over, maybe it gets you a little bit more confused. So it's really up to you. Here comes, this was the close yarn over. So V shape is out front. So knit front thread, right? And then knit mid stitch, and now left shifting, so V shape is at the back, so you gotta knit back loop. So you can remember you have to knit V-shape thread. You know what I'm saying? Whenever you increase enough, let's move on to leg opening. I add 4 markers for leg openings. In between markers, I have 7 stitches each for leg opening. And I made little mistake here. I was supposed to create the leg opening, right leg opening first, but I passed it. I started with left leg because when I knit dog sweater, usually begin marker is in the middle of right leg, so I usually wait, but this time I shouldn't have. Anyway, here comes left leg. Again, in between markers, I have 7 stitch, and here comes, I start binding off. And you realize, ended up, I bind off only 6 stitch in between markers. There we go. This is 5th and 6th. So where is one more stitch? That's the one on the right needle. So remove the marker and knit one more, then you bind 7th stitch off. That's the tip number 7. Be careful about last bind off. And I just finished the right leg bind off. So move on to left leg again. Now I have to create new cast on. How many stitch I bind off? In previous row, 7. So I am going to add 7 new cast. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's it. And then just keep knitting. This is same method as 2 rows buttonhole. So if you want to create the buttonhole, this is how you do it. And one more thing I want to mention about this opening thing, please don't forget to create the leash opening, right, on the back. And then you really have to count from the mid stitch evenly towards the back, and then put the marker on just like the legs opening, right? And exactly same method. Row number 1, bind off. Row number 2, add new cast. That's about it. I just don't want you to forget to create leash opening as well. There you go. That's my dog's leash opening because his leash is not around his neck, shoulder braid. So little lower than his neck rib. Tip number 8. When you knit new cast, just top of the bind off, I add new cast, right? Don't pull too hard because whenever you pull right needle like that, the stitch on the left needle become smaller and smaller and tighter. So I know it's kind of slippery, so you tend to kind of pull right apart, but it's gonna get worse. So you have to hold needle loosely and maybe you have to put your finger on a stitch, left stitch, and try to get stitch loose, and that'll be easier. All right, this is tip number 8. This time it wasn't that bad because I was using the thick yarn, right? But if you're using thinner needle and thinner yarn, it's gonna get worse and worse. So please remember that. Loose. That's the key word, all right? And after the leg opening, just keep knitting until your desired length for tummy. And here comes tip number 9. Again, when you're using magic loop technique with thicker needle, I want you to be careful one thing. Because all the stitch are on the cable, which is a lot thinner than needle, you tend to pull the working yarn, which is the stitch on the cable, become smaller and smaller and tighter like that. So knitting this row is fine, but when you come back to knit that stitch, it's gonna be harder and harder, especially if you're using much thicker needle, because stitch is already getting smaller, right? So you can't put the needle back. So if you don't want that happen, you have to kind of loosen up. Sometimes, the people knit so tight. That's habit, right? But if you're using magic loop technique, especially if you're knitting with thicker needle, you gotta be very careful. Because if it's thinner needle, you can kind of, push the needle back in. But the thicker needle, oh boy, it's really hard to push the needle back in. So at the very beginning, don't pull the working yarn too hard, okay? You know what I'm saying? I just pushed the little stitch, right? That's the part you would be struggled. And I just want to make sure you understand what I'm talking about. So now I keep knitting and knitting until this side, right? And once all the stitches are gone from the left needle, here comes. Now you have to prepare, right? So pull the cable and push the needle back in. This is the time you will have struggle at the end because you pulled the working yarn so hard when you knit first one right here. So don't pull the working yarn too hard, especially first stitch. This is the reason why told you the knitting stitch to start with is much easier because, if it's the purl and you kind of confuse, with the working yarn or which side and, come around and all that, and you tend to pull working yarn so hard. Look, really hard to push, right? But I didn't really pull the working yarn too hard. That's why I could push stitch back onto the needle. But if you really pull the yarn harder, it's a disaster. I done that a few times. So please be careful about that. Now I knitted it enough length for tummy. tummy has to be shorter than back because they need to pee. So I add 2 markers, tummy stitches. And I'm going to knit only back piece, and when I start knitting back piece, I am going to decrease both sides. So let's start. Decreasing rule. You need decrease some stitches on knitting side, which is right side. So I'm knitting across the tummy right now. And tip number 9, you knit until tummy marker and remove. Then I want to transfer those stitches, but you have to knit one more and then slide last stitch back onto left needle because I need that working yarn ready, right? Then you will transfer all the tummy stitch. Again, dog has to pee, so the tummy length should be a lot shorter than back piece. If you need to know when to stop, why don't you put that on to your doggy? So it's done. So let's start knitting back piece. I am going to slide 1 stitch back onto right needle and then SSK. Slip, slip, knit. I decrease 1 stitch on the right side, right? So knit all the way down to last 3 stitch, not there, just before the stitch holder right there, right there. You knit all the way down. And here comes end of right side. 3 stitch, then knit 2 together, then knit last one. Now turn around and decreasing row number 2 is all knit. If you ever watch my basic dog sweater tutorial, usually repeat of decreasing row number 1 and row number 2. However, if you want really long back piece but not enough stitch count, like I said, I usually start with cast on 70, but this time I only made 34 cast on, so not enough stitches to decrease. So what I did is row number 1, decreasing row number 1, decrease. Row number 2, all knit. Then row number 3 should be same as row number 1, but I didn't decrease. Then row number 4 is all knit. Then I repeat row number 1 to row number 4, which means I decrease 2 stitch every 4 rows. You know what I'm saying? Instead of the decrease in every other row, of course you can knit longer, right? So I just finished the decreasing row number 2, and this is decreasing row number 3. Again, I am not decreasing because I want to knit much longer, but I don't have enough stitch to decrease. Now let's look at the result. I decreased 5 times, which is row number 1, and total of 10 stitch I decreased, which means you have to repeat row number 1 5 times. So 5 times 4 is 20. I knit 20. However, if I decrease every other row, I can only knit 10 rows. You know what I'm saying? And you lose 10 stitches within 10 rows. So if you don't mind shorter back piece, you can decrease every other rows. However, because you don't have enough stitches, so you can't knit longer, just take your time. Don't decrease every other rows. Decrease every 4 rows, just like I told you. You know what I'm saying? So that's the trick. And if you want to get longer and longer, you can add 2 more rows, so you can decrease every 6 rows, every 8 rows, something like that. So you will decrease slowly. You know what I'm saying? That was the tip number 10. Now I hit my desired length. So let's connect all around again. I am going to knit rib all around again. So now I am preparing, transfer all the tummy stitch back onto needle, and you have to start on right side, which is knitting side, because you're going to knit in round again. So if you're facing to wrong side now, big no. Okay, so my working yarn is this side, the right side, so I can start with right side. And you just knit across. Whenever you knit until the end, there's no more stitch. So now on the side, you have to knit up, which is you have to pick up the stitches and using on the edge. By the way, if you are knitting up on the edge, you have to face to right side. This applies to any other knitting, because whenever you're knitting up like this, okay, back side, there's a little, hem, like a little seam. You know what I'm saying? So you don't want that seam outside, right? So all you have to do is face to right side, which is outside of the fabric, and then start knitting up. And whenever you knit up, you have to count the stitches because there is the other side. And then knit across. This is tummy side. Then you knit up the other side, same amount as the first one. Okay? Then start making rib. Repeat off, knit 1 and purl 1. Before you start, you should count, because I need stitch count multiple of 2. And I made the rib until desired length. Let's cast off. I usually use the technique called stretchy cast off using the tapestry needle. However, this time I am going to use one size bigger needle. I was using 8mm, so now 9mm. If you don't like the stretchy cast off, bind off with the tapestry needle because it's too much hassle, use bigger needle, one size bigger, and try to bind off a little loosely. That means you're using a little bit more yarn to bind off. That makes little space in between binding off. That makes it stretchy. So, key for stretchy bind off is using more yarn to bind off. Almost done. Hang in there. Now, weave the ends off. This is not really tip, but I'll talk about it. First of all, you kind of connect ends and begin, and then you always weave the ends off at the back. I usually use knitting stitch. Go along the knitting stitch. That makes really nice looking weaving because you don't really see. Alright, but it's really up to you. There's no strict rule or anything like that, as long as it's very secure. And this is it. Stretchy bind off. I think it's crucial because if it's very tight around there, number one, dog is not comfortable. Number two, you will struggle to put the sweater on. So stretchy bind off, you should use this technique. Again, this wasn't step-by-step knitting dog sweater. I just want to give you the tips that I usually use. And if you want to watch the step-by-step video, please go check my description box. Once you watch the basic dog sweater video, you probably understand more about this. Alright? Enjoy knitting!